Semi-structured interviews and scale-based questionnaires are two of the most important and widely used data collection tools in social science research. Both of these tools have their own advantages and disadvantages, or you can say strengths and weaknesses, and both of them serve a variety of purposes in different contexts. So what are the relative strengths and possible weaknesses or challenges of semi-structured interviews and scale-based questionnaires? We will briefly respond to this question. So first of all, the possible strengths of semi-structured interviews. So as we know that semi-structured interviews are interviews or interview schedules that have a set of questions, and so there is a set of questions, but the flexibility comes from the fact that the interviewer can add to, or the researcher can add to or reduce the list of those questions when they are actually practically conducting the interview. So there is some level of structure in semi-structured interviews, but there is also some level of flexibility or room for addition or deletion of questions. So what are its strengths? So first of all, semi-structured interviews are useful because these interviews help us in obtaining in-depth and contextual data. And the reason that these help us in depth or detailed contextual data, contextual actually means that during such interviews we can actually explore the context from which the interviewees are coming, or the context of the issue that we are exploring. So that's the first thing, that it helps us in getting detailed data. Secondly, semi-structured interviews are flexible. And so as we are conducting interviews, and as is the requirement of the situation, and as is the requirement of the information that we are getting from the respondents, the flexible nature of semi-structured interviews, where you can actually add questions to the list, or you can maybe reduce the questions in the list, keeping in view the information or the data that is coming to you. So sometimes, for example, if you are asking question number 3 and the respondent, when they are responding, they also answers your question number 4 or 5. So you do not need to actually ask those questions. So what you do is just remove that from the list of the possible questions that you are asking. So there is that flexibility. Similarly, it happens in a natural environment. So what you can say is that it's a kind of conversation that is taking place. So two people are sitting in a natural environment and they are discussing the issue of their generally mutual interest. So that natural type of environment could also be considered as one of its strengths. Thirdly, semi-structured interviews allow the researchers to probe certain issues further. So probing is actually when the interviewee has responded to something and the interviewer wants to know more about that thing, or to know about the other aspects of that thing. So the additional questions that they can ask are termed as probes. And next, prompts. In some cases, the interviewers ask questions and the respondents find it, for example, difficult, or find those questions tricky, or in some cases maybe they're not clear about like how to respond to those questions. So prompts are things where the interviewers can help or assist the interviewee in getting started or in responding to certain questions. And lastly, the other important strength is that it helps semi-structured interviews actually help in building rapport between the researcher, the interviewer, and the interviewee, in the sense that such interviews take place in a natural environment. Now, the next, what are some of the weaknesses of semi-structured interviews? So, as is clear from the very nature of interviews, is that interviews generally take place in a natural environment. It's in a form of questions or answer, or in discussion form. So as a result, in comparison to, for example, the preparing of a questionnaire and then the filling of a questionnaire, generally interviews are more time consuming in comparison to other data collection tools. Next, there could be anonymity issues, and anonymity issues is generally researchers who want to ensure anonymity, which is actually that the participant remains anonymous in the study. In interviews, it's not possible, because the interviewer or the researcher actually knows about the particulars, for example, the names and identities of the interviewees. So as a result, this is something that is not possible. So anonymity issues can arise. Then in many cases, interviewees are quite busy, and so they are not accessible, especially if there is a study that includes busy people or people who are on important posts or undertakings. That can lead to access issues. In some cases, security issues could also lead to access issues. So this is something that could also be considered as one of the possible challenges or weaknesses of the interview method of data collection. Subjectivity on the part of the interviewer, as well as on the part of the interviewee, in terms of asking questions, in terms of exploring an issue, and in terms of responding to that issue, is something that could also be an issue. So in comparison to for example, scale-based questionnaire, this is something where there might be more involvement of the subjective opinion of the interviewer and the interviewee. Then in some cases there could be interviewer bias or effect, where the bias of the interviewer or the researcher to actually make or to get data from the interviewee that are in line with their own interest. So that is something that could also be considered as a possible weakness of the. So in some cases the interviewer will be asking questions, or they will be asking questions in a way that will make the respondent respond in a way that is to the liking of the interviewer. And lastly, importantly, although data collection process through interview might be more interesting and it could be more convenient, but when it comes to data analysis, in comparison to questionnaires where we get quantitative data, the qualitative data that comes through semi-structured interviews is quite difficult and complex in terms of analysis. So the analysis process becomes quite difficult at times and quite complex. Now, scale-based questionnaires, as the very name suggests, are questionnaires that have a list of questions that generally have a response in the form of a scale or in the form of, let's say, yes-no answers. So scale-based questionnaires also have its strengths. First of all, scale-based questionnaires are generally used in surveys, in quantitative surveys. And the first important strength of it is that it's efficiency, which actually means that it's an efficient way of collecting data, large-scale data generally, in a shorter period of time. So that's you can say that the efficiency in that sense that it gets us a lot of data, a large-scale data in lesser time and perhaps with lesser cost. Secondly, the data that comes through scale-based questionnaires is quantifiable, and so it's quite useful for quantitative researchers or for researchers who conduct quantitative research. Thirdly, generally, it is easier to standardize the process of research using scale-based questionnaire. So the data is standardized, it's in number. Similarly, its analysis is standardized, it's in numbers and statistics. Next, it is much easier to ensure anonymity to the respondents in scale-based questionnaires, which is quite difficult or maybe impossible in interview data. When we use interview as a tool. And next, large-scale data. In comparison to interview as a research tool, questionnaires help us in getting large-scale data that is generally required in researches that are aimed at generalization and statistical analysis. And lastly, generally the analysis is straightforward and less complex as comparison to qualitative to interview data, because statistics is generally involved and the researchers have already decided what statistics are they going to use when they get their data through the questionnaire. Now, questionnaires also have certain weaknesses or certain challenges. And so those, for example, include lack of depth. So the data that we get through questionnaires is generally lacking in depth. Generally, the opinions are explored in a superficial manner, and we do not get into the in-depth perceptions of respondents. Secondly, there is a bit of rigidity in terms of the kind of responses that we get from the respondents. And so respondents have little choice if they disagree with the choices in the scale-based questionnaire. Thirdly, it could also include response bias or typical responses. In some cases, we get typical responses to our scale-based questionnaires, and as a result, there is less thought used on the part of the respondents. Thirdly or fourthly, questionnaire interpretation variability. In many cases, the questionnaires that we give to respondents, they might interpret the items in the questionnaire very differently, and so that variation in the interpretation could lead to data that might not be very authentic. Then possible lack of respondent comprehension is also something that is related to this one. In some cases, they might misinterpret or miscomprehend the question, and so the response will not be what actually should be the response. Lack of context, and so this is another weakness where the respondents generally do not know the detailed context of the research, why the data is being collected and how is the data going to be used and so on. So lack of context is another weakness. Then non-serious responses. In many cases, respondents, when they are like filling the forms or the questionnaires, they generally just want to get done with the job, and that could actually lead to non-serious responses. So they might be ticking certain boxes without even thinking about it, and as a result, the data that we will be getting will not be authentically representing their viewpoints or their perceptions. And very lastly, non-genuine responses. Again, this is something where perhaps the respondents believe in one thing, but they are responding to the questionnaire or the form in a way that they think is something that they should just present, or that is something that is socially acceptable. So non-genuine responses could also be one of the weaknesses of the questionnaire-based studies. So to summarize, semi-structured interviews and questionnaires both are important data collection tools, and they have their own purposes. They are used keeping in view the particular objectives of the research studies. So semi-structured interviews are generally used in qualitative studies where we need detailed perceptions or views of the respondents, while questionnaires are used in quantitative surveys where we are interested basically in the generalization of our research. Both of these have their strengths and their weaknesses, and so we just described a list of the